Hi, Miss Nikki here. Welcome to Chapter 6. We're going to cover the integumentary system, or probably an easier word to spell out, skin, right? We're also going to talk about some accessory um, items like hair, fingernails. We'll talk about some of those exocrine glands that we talked about in the Chapter 5 epithelial section. We'll also talk about some burns, kind of healing, regeneration, and then lastly we'll talk about aging. Integumentary system, so not just skin, but all those accessory tissues that we just talked about. These two, if you remember, these are exocrine glands. We talked about them when we talked about epithelial tissue. This is the sebaceous, which is the oil gland. And if you remember, the method of secretion is holocrine, where the entire cell ruptures and everything that's inside the cell comes out. And then we have the sweat gland, that was merocrine secretion, and it produced sweat, kind of that watery substance that we use to help cool ourselves off. So we did mention the word cutaneous membrane last chapter. So cutaneous membrane, integument, which means skin, integumentary system, kind of all the same here. Barrier to the outside world, and visually it can tell you a little bit about what's going on. We've all been really cold and had our fingertips turn blue, right? So there is some visual indication that the skin can give about overall health. Dermatology is obviously the study of the skin. We have two layers of skin or integument. The first is the epidermis. The epidermis is on top, and you can see epi, upon, on top, above the dermis. It's composed of stratified squamous epithelium. So this should tell you stratified layers, right? Squamous should tell you shape. And when we look at epithelium, we should think about function and we should think about vascularity. So if it's epithelium, its functions could be absorption, secretion, or protection. But we know stratified layers that our function is probably going to be protection. And then what about vascularity? So epithelial tissue is avascular, does not have its own direct blood supply. So beneath or deep to the epidermis is the dermis layer, and it's primarily made of dense irregular connective tissue. So you remember the irregular connective tissue kind of had these bundles of fibers, of collagen fibers, and it allowed for flexibility. You're also going to see areolar connective tissue, which had a lot of ground substance and a lot of white space for blood vessels. So it would kind of make sense that these connective tissues would be directly below the epithelium. There's another layer here, but it's not technically part of the skin. I kind of think of it as a boundary layer. So you're going to have your epidermis, and then you're going to have your dermis. And those two are technically skin. And then you're going to have this hypodermis, which is below the dermis, and it has a lot of adipose tissue, so fat. And then below the hypodermis is where you're going to have muscle. So hypodermis kind of acts as this boundary or separation point between these two organ systems. Here's a nice image from your textbook that's showing you the epidermis and the dermis. So remember, these are the two layers of the integument. And then the dermis has two sublayers. So we have the papillary layer, which is about here to here, and you can kind of just draw that all the way across. And then, so they'll say that's the top third, and then the bottom 2/3 is called the reticular layer. And that's because they're made up of different types of connective tissue. So we'll talk more about this, but the papillary is made up of areolar connective tissue. And the reticular layer we just saw, or it was mentioned, the dense irregular connective tissue. And then everything above the papillary layer, all of this, is the epidermis. And there's 5 layers here that we're going to talk about, well, 4 or 5 depending if it's thick or thin skin, but we're going to talk about the layers within the epidermis in the next couple of slides. You can see there's lots of accessory structures that are inside the integumentary system, and these will be covered in lab in more detail, so make sure that you go look at your lab list and that you go to APR and you actually view these images. Here we have the layers of the epidermis. So we have the basal, which is the deepest, and we have the corneum, which is superficial. Remember that epidermis is keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. So right here in the middle, we're going to start producing lots of keratin, which is a lipid protein that offers us waterproofing from the outside. So these 3 layers are living, and these 2 layers are dead cells. Another way to look at this is start at the top. So corneum, lucidum, granulosum, spinosum, basal. So remember, this is the deepest layer. So what we're saying, these cells here, these are living. And then we start producing lots and lots and lots of keratin in the cells. So then these cells are all going to be dead cells exposed to the external environment. The cells that make up your epidermis are called keratinocytes. Gee, they're cells that make keratin, right? I love it when names work, right? Here we have the deepest epidermal layer. That's the stratum basal or basal. We have the 3 cell types. We have keratinocytes, and you're probably thinking, oh, they're going to make keratin. And melanocytes, they're going to make melanin. And tactile cells, which are touch receptors. So basically, if these touch receptors, these tactile cells, if they have pressure put on them by something touching your epidermis, they can release chemicals and send a message to your brain, and that alerts you that something's crawling on your skin or touching your skin. The next layer is the stratum spinosum. So we're kind of moving up, right? We have the stratum basal or basal, and then we have our spinosum. Next, we're going to see granulosum. Okay, so we're here at spinosum. These are still keratinocytes. And I want you to realize that these are being pushed up as the cells in the lower stratum divide. We're pushing cells up to the top. This is also where we're going to find dendritic cells. These are going to basically initiate immune response. So usually we think of dendritic cells as macrophages. They're kind of guarding the lower strata of the epidermis so that items can't get into the dermis where they have a direct blood supply. Next up, we have stratum granulosum. These are still keratinocytes. They begin producing tons of keratin, and when the keratin fills, you'll see the nucleus and the organelles start to break down. Stratum lucidum is the next layer up. This is superficial to the stratum granulosum, and this is found only in thick skin on the palms and the soles of our feet, and it's filled with this translucent protein. This is kind of a breakdown of keratin, so it's kind of like an intermediate of the breakdown of keratin, and it's eliodin. And this actually helps protect against UV damage to any tissue below. The most superficial layer is the stratum corneum. It's going to have many, many layers of interlocking, dead, keratinized cells. So at this point, we're just sacs of keratin, right? This is not a living cell. The dry, thick surface is a protection against abrasion resistance and infection. Nice image here of the dermal strata. You can see the stratum basal, so here's the stratum basal, and you can see that it has melanocytes and it has those tactile cells. And then you get to spinosum, get it out, and here we have those dendritic cells. So what's nice is these are kind of wanderers. They kind of wander between, and they stop any pathogen from getting, hopefully, getting past the skin layers and into your dermis. So why is this important? Why do we need to have a gate guard here, kind of making sure that nothing gets past all of these layers that's not supposed to? Because remember what's in your dermis. Your dermis is connective tissue. Connective tissue is vascular, right? So these are blood vessels. So it's important to memorize things, but it's also important to understand kind of the big picture and why we have the structures where we have them, right? So then we get to the granulosum. This is where we have living keratinocytes that are making tons of keratin. And you can see, here's that waterproofing layer. Everything above is dead and everything below is living. Stratum lucidum you can only see in thick connective tissue, thick epidermal tissue. So that would be palms of the hand and soles of the feet. And then we have this nice, really thick 20 to 30 layers of dead keratinocytes filled with keratin, and that's the stratum corneum. Just to clarify the thick versus thin, so thick skin, palms of the hand, soles of the feet, has all 5 layers, sweat glands, but no hair follicles or sebaceous glands. Thin skin is going to cover the rest of the body. It lacks the stratum lucidum, and we're going to have sweat glands and hair follicles and sebaceous glands. Nice image comparing the two. You can see in thick skin, the stratum corneum is a lot thicker. And then I'm not sure if you can see on this slide, they didn't exaggerate it as much as they did for the other slide, but that white kind of shiny layer, that's the lucidum. You can definitely see that there is no white shiny layer here. So this is thin skin. It's going to have less stratum corneum and it's going to have no stratum lucidum. Skin color is derived from these 3 pigments. So I mentioned this before, a pigment is a protein that gives off a specific color. So hemoglobin would be due to the red color. The hemoglobin is what makes up your red blood cells, and then how those red blood cells look underneath all the collagen that's in your dermis. So hemoglobin, you kind of think of a red, pink hue. Melanin, you're going to think of a brownish hue. And then keratin, you're going to think of kind of that yellow orange. So basically, all skin color is just various amounts of these different pigments. Melanocytes produce melanin, but it is stored in keratinocytes. So you can see just a one-word change could affect a question. Melanocytes make melanin, keratinocytes store melanin. So the whole point of melanocytes are to produce this melanin pigment that can protect other cells like keratinocytes from UV damage from sunlight. So basically, if you have the sun shining this direction on this patch of skin, the melanocytes are going to produce melanin and they're going to release melanin granules, and then those melanin granules are going to be picked up by the keratinocytes, and they form kind of this umbrella barrier around the nucleus, the DNA of those keratinocytes. They're trying to stop the ultraviolet lights from the sun from damaging the keratinocytes. So there are several genes responsible for skin color. We go all the way from kind of this very light skin tone all the way to a very dark skin tone, and it depends on how many dominant alleles that you have. If you don't know what that means, it's not a big deal. Just we have several genes on our DNA that are deciding our skin color, but it's based on these melanocytes and how much pigment they make. So you can have some melanocytes that make tons of pigment, and you can have some melanocytes that make less. There are also enzymes, and remember, enzymes are proteins with jobs, and these proteins are coded from DNA. You can have enzymes that break down melanin at different rates. So say you were in a sun-intense environment, let's say equator, right? Near the equator. You are making more melanin, and your enzymes to break down melanin are really slow. they're not working as well, or they don't break down as much melanin. So you have extra melanin and you're not breaking it down as quickly, you're probably going to have darker skin tone. This is beneficial for you because you live in an area where there's lots of sun. We have several skin markings listed here. So nevus or nevus, this is a mole. This is an overgrowth of a melanocyte. So a melanocyte that's just grown larger. You can have freckles, which are just areas where you have a lot of melanocyte activity and lots of melanin being produced. You can also have skin discoloration, hemangiomas. This would be kind of a reddish color. And then friction ridges. So this is what leads to our fingerprints. So they're kind of folds in the dermis and the epidermis. And I'll show you an image in just a second. Nice image here of friction ridges. We would say fingerprints. Remember, this is thick skin, so we have a lot of stratum corneum and we have that stratum lucidum, and it forms these peaks and valleys, and this gives us our fingerprints. So just FYI, because I think it's interesting, finger ridges also help us grip items better. So koalas and all primates have fingerprints. No other animals have fingerprints or friction ridges. Finally, we move to the dermis. This is deep to the epidermis. This is composed of connective tissue. Remember, there's two sublayers, right? There's the papillary and the reticular layer. There are other structures present. So we have blood vessels and we have glands and we have follicles, and we're going to kind of go through some of these in the PowerPoint. First, we have the papillary layer of the dermis. So remember, we have epidermis here, and we've got 5 layers. And then we have our dermis here. And remember, the top third is going to be the papillary layer. And then that bottom 2/3 is going to be the reticular layer. And they're made of different types of tissue. So the papillary layer has areolar connective tissue, and the reticular layer has dense, irregular connective tissue. These dermal papillae are going to become important, so I'll show you when we finally get to the image, but that's what we call those finger-like projections from the dermis into the epidermis. I like how they peeled back the epidermis here so that you can actually see these dermal papillae projections. To me, they're kind of like finger projections. And something to think about, what happens if you just have 2 sheets of paper? If I had just flat structures, I had the epidermis and then the dermis here. If I have 2 flat sheets, they can kind of move, right? We could slide them past each other. But what happens if I have a flat sheet and then I take and insert these finger-like projections? Now it's not easy to shear these 2 sections away from each other, right? We have kind of an interlocking mechanism that allows us to hold these 2 layers together more tightly. We know that the dermis is connective tissue, and we know the connective tissue is made up of ground substance and cells, and the third thing are fibers. And we know that connective tissue has lots of collagen, and certain tissues elastic fibers. The dermis has lots of collagen, lots of elastic, and they're organized in these kind of parallel bundles. We also need to talk about lines of cleavage that form, but it's probably better if we look at the image. Next here, they're talking about if the skin is stretched beyond its capabilities. I like to think of the skin as stretching too fast, like if you're pregnant, you can tear collagen fibers and they can't be regenerated. All they do is kind of knit themselves back together so that your skin doesn't physically tear, but they're never going to have their function again. So this is where we get stretch marks. And the technical term for those is striae. I think this is an interesting topic, these lines of cleavage. So this is kind of a map showing you what the lines of cleavage could look like in an individual. And we're talking about the bundle of collagen and elastic fibers, and they kind of form these lines. And you can look at this and see which one would probably heal more quickly. If you cut across the grain of these cleavage lines, it's probably going to take a lot longer to heal. And you may not have complete repair, right? You might end up with scar tissue. Where if we cut between cleavage lines or parallel to cleavage lines, we're more likely to have, a quick healing, and you may not have scar tissue. Subcutaneous, hypodermis layer, or superficial fascia. So this is not part of the integumentary. It's not one of the two layers of integument. It's going to have connective tissue, both areolar and adipose. So usually we focus on the epidermis having lots of adipose tissue, but it does have areolar tissue where wherever you see this, you should also be thinking lots of blood vessels. The function of this layer is to protect. You also have an energy storage, right? You're storing fat, which is secondary to glucose as an energy storage to make ATP. And then we're also acting as an insulator. This is also a common drug injection site because the blood vessels are much larger in the hypodermis. Here we have the functions of integument. I would look through each of these, and it's fine to memorize certain things, but you'll have a better understanding if you can give me examples of how the skin protects based on what we just talked about. So protects from bodily injury. We just talked about stratum corneum, and we talked about that it offers abrasion resistance, right? That protects the body from injury. Harmful substances and microbes. Do we have a way to stop them from getting into our blood vessels? And you should think of those dendritic cells, right? The dendritic cells in the stratum spinosum that stop microbes from getting past all those layers into our dermis and our blood vessels. Do we have a way to protect against UV radiation? Hopefully you're thinking melanin, right? Prevention of water loss and gain. So the epidermis is water resistant. It doesn't completely stop the transfer of water, and we know this because we lose water by sweat, right? Metabolic regulation, we didn't go into too much detail, but you have to turn this calcitriol into vitamin D, and you do that by sunlight. So sunlight is going to activate this precursor chemical to turn into vitamin D, and we need this to absorb calcium and phosphate from our diet. And when you see these two words, you should be thinking about bone. Remember how we store calcium and phosphate in our bones. Continuing with the functions, we know that the skin can produce secretions, and it can also absorb certain items. So in the secretion, we know we have sweat, but there are some waste products in our sweat. So there is some salt along with the water. And then we can also have urea, which is a chemical byproduct from the breakdown of proteins or amino acids. The skin can absorb certain chemicals. I'm sure we've heard of transdermal patches, right? So certain chemicals can be absorbed through the skin, but other chemicals cannot be absorbed. Immune function, we already mentioned those dendritic cells that are kind of monitoring the passage of pathogens between the layers. They can also initiate an immune response. We have temperature regulation. So not only sweating, that thermal regulation, but also you can have blood vessels that either constrict to conserve heat, or you can have blood vessels that dilate or open to release heat. And then last, we have that sensory reception. So remember we talked about the touch receptors, or we called them tactile cells. Those can alert the body to something moving on the skin or pressing on the skin. Briefly want to talk about the structure of nails. So these are modifications of the stratum corneum, and they actually assist in protecting the tips of our digits, our fingertips, right? They can also assist in grabbing an object. The white kind of free edge means that there's no capillaries underneath, so there's no blood supply. So we can cut these off, right? We can cut off the whitish free edge, we can file it, doesn't cause any pain. The pinkish nail body has underlying capillaries. And then we have something called the nail root, or you might think of it as the nail plate, and then we have the nail bed. So this is the nail bed is the living epidermis covered by the nail body. Nice image of the fingernail here. I really just want you to see that the nail body is directly in contact with the dermis here. The dermis is in pink. So that's why it hurts if you damage the nail body, because we have lots of nerves here, and we also have lots of blood vessels. So this is why it bleeds or it causes a lot of pain if you damage the nail body. The free edge has no capillaries. It's an extension off of the nail body, so therefore we can file it and cut it and get rid of it. Another thing to look at is the phalanx or the finger bone. So you can see here the finger bone, and then there's going to be fat. There's also going to be tendons here. So tendons attach to muscle. And one of the things that's interesting when we get to muscles, we'll see that the fingers don't have any muscles in them. So your fingers are all controlled by the muscles of your forearm. Next, we move on to hair. It's found almost everywhere on the body. Remember, not the palms of the hand and the soles of the feet. Basically, keratinized cells are going to form these slender filaments. They're going to grow from hair follicles. And we have different types of hair. So this downy hair, kind of baby hair, and then we have very fine hair, and then we have coarser terminal hair. If we look at hair structure, there are 3 zones. So there's a bulb at the base, and it has a hair papilla. You remember how we talked about dermal papilla? It's kind of the same thing when we say hair papilla. It's just this infolding of connective tissue that's in the base or the hair bulb. Then we're going to have the root. So that's the hair from the bulb to the surface of the skin. Once the hair projects beyond the surface of the skin, it's called a hair shaft. We also have a hair follicle, and this is going to surround the hair root. This is probably what we're most familiar seeing. If you had pulled hair out by the root, the hair follicle is the outer part that you would see that's surrounding the hair root. We have the erector pili. This is smooth muscle. So when you see smooth muscle, you should think involuntary control, right? So this smooth muscle is extending from the hair follicle to the dermal papillae. Remember, those are the projections from the dermis into the epidermis. And this is what causes goosebumps. Nice image here of the hair. We can see the hair bulb. We can see the hair root. And then once it passes the surface of the skin, it now becomes the hair shaft. Down here we have the hair papilla. So this is the little projection, kind of like a dermal papilla, and that's going to have blood vessels, right? This is going to be the living part that allows for the development of the hair shaft. Here we can see the erector pili muscle, and this is smooth muscle. Remember, that contracts, and when it contracts, the hairs will stand up, and that's what we call goosebumps, right? So the idea here for this involuntary control is that if you're cold, we can contract the erector pili muscle, and it'll cause your hairs to kind of fluff, and when they fluff, they can trap heat close to your skin, so it'll keep you warm. Some functions here of hair. It's going to offer us protection. You could think of your scalp, right? The hair on top of your head is going to stop your head from getting sunburned, and your supercomputer brain is right underneath, so we want to protect that area, right? Protection, you can also think of your eyebrows. They stop sweat from rolling into your eyes. Again, those eyebrows offer some sort of facial expression, right? Eyelashes, we can tell whether somebody is, making a frowny face or smiling, right? Heat retention. Again, you could think of the scalp here. It's the same idea if you put a hat on, right? So the hair on top of your head helps keep or retain body heat and keep us warm. We have sensory reception. We talked about those tactile cells that allow us to know if something is touching our skin. And then your book mentions visual identification. So we can usually tell about how old somebody is, whether their hair is graying or not. We can usually tell male versus female. So it does give us some visual cues. Hair color is based on the synthesis of melanin. Unfortunately, as we age, everything stops working as well, and so gray hair will result when we have reduced melanin production in the hair follicle. There's also some hair growth phases listed here. I don't think I have any questions about that. Double check with the learning objectives for hair growth. Hair loss, we fight, right? This is a billion-dollar business. We don't want to lose our hair. But it's normal to lose hair every day, and it's normal for our hair to thin as we age. So this term alopecia, It's just the thinning of hair. Now, sometimes people have severe alopecia, and it can happen in young adults due to various reasons: stress, genetics, hormones. Males have male pattern baldness where they're only going to lose hair on the crown of their head, the front part, and then we can also have excessive hairiness. I've decided to break up this PowerPoint, so we will continue with part 2. Talk to you guys soon.